We're recording. We're here with John. How are you doing today, John?
Good, good. Glad to be here. Thank you.
Absolutely. You have a Substack that my initial impression from that is it's about Buddhism, theism, Jungian psychoanalysis. Analysis. You say that you are using your words to help us see. This is actually put in sort of a prayer. May my words help us see. May my words help us after we see. Words are mind magic. May I wield this magic with courage, skill, and great compassion. And you say you are cultivating mental and emotional resilience through Buddhist practice and insight. So tell me a little bit about how you came to identify, or I don't know if you identify as a Buddhist as a noun, or if you see Buddhism as a verb, as something anybody can do from any juncture. But how did you begin your Buddhist practice?
I trace my Buddhism. The other day, I was reflecting on this back to my college days. So I attended Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah, which speaks to my Mormon roots, which will always be a part of me. I don't necessarily seek to escape my heritage. I'm working to integrate and to claim it. So my my heritage and culture of origin is Mormon, and they like to be referred to, I guess, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They're kind of distancing themselves from the Mormon moniker. But so in an art class at BYU in my final year of BYU, it was because I have an art minor, I did a sculpture of a Buddha. And it was such a spiritual, creative Zen experience for me. And I worked so hard on that for so many hours, and I loved it. And it got put on the shelf for firing. And I took pictures of it before it got fired. And then I went to go pick it up after it got fired, and it was never to be seen again. And and so it just makes me curious about my different encounters being steeped deeply in Mormon culture, and BYU is the official university of the LDS Church. But even then, I was drawn to, I guess, the iconography and the spirit of Buddhism. And and to fast forward, then I think about 8 years ago, when something just snapped inside of me, and I could no longer stomach or handle Orthodox Mormon belief and practice. My life just kind of fell apart, and it was just a tumbling of dominoes leading up to my divorce last year. And over that time, I just discovered, um, you know, exposure online, different discords and things like that. I got introduced to this. I don't want to call it a strange book because it's just a glorious book. And it's online. It's called Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha by Daniel Ingram, by the Arahant Daniel Ingram. And he's made his work freely available at mctv.org. And I just got really sucked into that because he was just dead serious. I've never seen anyone so incredibly serious and almost scientific and intellectual about Buddhist practice. Like, I knew secular Buddhism was a thing, but this guy came straight out of the gate in his big, thick ass book with a warning, that this kind of practice and training the mind had real risks. And he just really spoke to my soul, like the things of the mind and the heart, that there was an anatomy to them and a system to them, and that we could go and explore and train them, and that there was real risk in doing so. Just really drew me in and got me really serious. I was already kind of a meditator on the light side, using the Headspace app, and this just drew me in further into uh, practicing and contemplating the Dharma, the teachings of the Buddha, more seriously. And through that practice, I'm almost done. Through that practice, it has shed so much light and insight on so many things, including my experience in my Mormon faith and with my Mormon heritage.
Yeah, you're not the first. I actually was speaking to someone today who was raised Christian and became a Satanist, and they said, "I'm not ex-Christian, I'm post-Christian." And now that
Oh,
they've actually left I forget what, because there's different forms of the Church of Satan. There's the Temple of Satan. I think it was the Temple of Satan. But they said I've left that,
mhm.
and I'm not an ex-Satanist. I'm a post-Satanist because I
Yeah,
felt
I
that.
follow the same guy on Substack. I
Okay,
love him.
cool. Then we know what we're talking about here. Where um, there's that. Did you feel I guess when you were going through that process, you said about 8 years ago, um, did you feel that was, uh, were you more having conflicts with things that Mormonism was presenting to you, that it was giving to you that you disagreed with, that it was oppositional to what you felt? Or do you feel that it just wasn't enough? There were areas of life that you wanted to explore and that Mormonism wasn't opening those doors to you, and it was kind of keeping those things closed. So I guess what I'm asking is, was it more of a an oppositional adversarial relationship that drove that split, or was it more of a feeling of tightness and narrowness that you wanted to explore outside of it?
The latter. Yes, the latter. I couldn't. My mind was locked inside of a limited space, and I couldn't go out, and I couldn't even think outside of that box. And so definitely that the latter one. Hmm.
Can you give me an example of one of those closed doors that you felt within Mormonism?
Yeah, I I have a just a very vivid kind of memory or story surrounding my this moment where it's often described in ex and post Mormon circles as the moment our shelf broke. There are many things inside of a faith, culture, group, and practice which are the unanswerable questions, the things we just need to accept on faith. And the metaphor is that we put those things on a shelf in the hopes that someday God will reveal the answer. Someday we'll have an answer. But in the meantime, these doubts, these concerns, these unanswered questions, these confusions, these dissonance, we just put it on a shelf and just keep on going. And so the metaphor is that if you put enough things on that shelf, the shelf eventually buckles and it all just kind of comes crashing down. And that moment was when I was reading in the Book of Mormon, as I was admonished to do on a daily basis. And I was dutifully reading my scriptures. In Moroni chapter 7, there's some verses that say, whatsoever is good cometh of Christ, and whatsoever is evil cometh of the devil. And by this you may know with a sure knowledge that everything that is good cometh of Christ, and everything that is evil cometh of the devil. And it just snapped to me. It just snapped in my mind. I'm just like, life is not this simple. Life is not this black and white. I can't do this anymore. I cannot do it. And the word that came to my mind was moralization. And I thought, is that even a word? Moralization? With in my mind, it just kind of came like, why do I have to look at the world and perceive it in either good or bad, Christ or Satan. The world isn't that way. The world isn't that simple. And so I took to the internet and Googled moralization and searched up an intellectual, an actual kind of a public, how should I put her? Her name is Eva Periakos, and she was the channeler of the Pathwork lectures, which I think you can find on pathwork.org or something like that. But this is many years ago. She's not modern and active, but this is, I think, in the 70s. But she channeled a series of lectures that I thought were very insightful. And I realized at that point that her experiences channeling spirits were similar to Joseph Smith's experience. Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism. Like, there's all sorts of these visionaries who are accessing some kind of what I think is a psychedelic portal. So if we're going to segue into psychedelics, which I have very limited experience with, but it seems to me like there is a portion of our brain which allows us some kind of access into our innately interconnected psyches or subconsciousnesses. And I realize that now. At the time, I had no clue. And I just felt like, again, I was married, I had kids, I had pressures like I still do, but at the time I just did not feel like my religious practice was it was adding to my burden rather than helping me and comforting me through it. And my mind just wanted to tear through all of the walls and constraints that I felt in my life and ask deeper questions about why everything was being presented to me through my faith in this way, that where a rather dogmatic way that was just, I felt like I couldn't fit the whole world and what I was seeing about the world and about my own unfoldings of consciousness and the grays of life and the nuances and the complexities. I couldn't fit it into a narrow, dogmatic, black and white religious framework anymore. And I know you're asking for specifics. More of them might come as we continue to talk. And I just want to kind of close this remark by saying that I now firmly understand and believe why we place limits and walls upon our own minds. And I believe that those kind of limitations and the kind of ensmallification of world is absolutely and fundamentally a necessary job of mind. Like, we need limits in order to function as in human society, as human individuals. We've got to have limits, and we actually bolster and provide those limits for each other in community. But I didn't understand that at the time. I just wanted to rip it all to shreds and try to understand, what am I feeling, what am I experiencing, and what is driving all of this.
I think that's true. I mean, I think oftentimes people think of the mind as a tool for expanding our awareness. Like, consciousness is a tool that we use to encapsulate more of the world, whereas animals, because they have smaller mind, a smaller consciousness, they have a more narrow experience. But we have a broader experience. We're experiencing more because we have more mind. So more mind, more awareness, more knowledge, more wisdom. But there's I don't know how to reconcile these two perspectives, but yeah, I agree that the function of the mind is to focus in, to narrow, to magnify, to specify, and to separate, to categorize, to put things in boxes, to say, this is part of this pattern, this is part of this pattern, rather than taking everything individually on its own merits. What the function of the mind is to say, Oh, you're you're a Pisces. Okay, so you're like this, or this, or oh, you're from this country. You're from this. You're from this religion. You're like this. And so that is a narrowness, that kind of discrimination, that kind of judgment. That's a primary function of the mind. And instead of being able to experience reality in its fullness, in the present of the moment, and fully appreciate. For example, if you take someone who's extremely focused on a certain paradigm of life, like I talk to people sometimes who are experiencing depression, and you could say, well, okay, you're depressed for X, Y, Z reason. And oftentimes it's a story or a narrative about how either the world is bad or they are bad. And I say, well, okay, why don't we try for a moment stepping outside of that paradigm and maybe go into an area of exception. Maybe you believe that the whole world is bad or you are bad, but let's step out of the world, let's step out of ourselves, and let's go into a garden with some flowers and smell those flowers and experience the goodness of that moment rather than always keeping that paradigm, always maintaining that. It's almost like in Christianity, you get this admonition to be praying constantly, ceaselessly praying. You're always
Oh.
thinking about Jesus. You're always thinking about God. This is the ideal. And that word that you use, moralizing, that is the effect. It is to constantly be moralizing. You're never allowed to experience a moment from that animalistic perspective of like how we would imagine, a cat or a dog or a simpler creature. It just sort of experiences reality in this magical way where things are appearing, things are disappearing, things are happening. There's actually a Terry Davis quote where he's programming on his computer, and there's a bird that perches itself near him and stares at his computer screen. And he says, I tried to imagine the mind of that bird, like what are the sort of bird thoughts that it's having? Because it's attempting in its own limited way to perceive the computer screen and to compare it to something that it can comprehend. And so maybe the bird thinks, oh, this is like some leaves that are moving in the wind. Or maybe it thinks the computer screen is a type of animal. Or maybe it thinks the computer screen is the surface of water and there's reflections on the surface of the water. So he thought, a bird is going to have some bird thoughts. And it's kind of like it's curious about what this thing is, but it doesn't actually have the ability to narrowly conceptualize what we would take to be the truth of the computer screen, that the computer screen, whatever we think we know about computers, a computer is a tool, it's a calculator, it's an artificial mind, it's an artificial intelligence, whatever words that we want to slap on a computer and put it in that box, we can say like, oh, well, the bird is wrong about the computer, and so animals are dumb, and they're therefore less moral because they have less consciousness. And killing an animal is okay. Killing a human is not, because we have all this more accuracy to our truth claims. But he was saying, when we compare ourselves to the mind of God, then we realize that all of our thoughts are just bird thoughts. And to put ourselves in that supreme moralizing position where we can say, I know that, if it's from the Book of Mormon, it's good, and if it's not, it's bad. That's like a bird thought. I mean, Terry Davis in his own right he described himself as being Jewish, although he wasn't ethnically Jewish. He was just like an Old Testament believer. So he probably had his own maybe contradictory ideas. But yeah, that's kind of what intelligence does, is it limits, and it also creates these anti-chronological moralizations where we constantly have to adhere to a paradigm that's not necessarily present. Did I leave the stove on? Like we have to be worried about the past, we have to be worried about the future, and we're not able to experience the present moment in a more elementary or animalistic or material way, because that we always have to be thinking. And so for secular atheists who think that they've freed themselves from a religious paradigm, but they're still thinking, well, I have to do good in school so I can go to college, so I can get a job, so I can afford to send my kids to college, so that they can send their kids to college. And it's like, okay, all of this moralization, all of this stress, all forcing yourself to do things you don't want to do for people who don't like you, who for employers who don't really respect you, or the respect that you gain is superficial because it's based on these artificial social constructs of this is what it means to be a good student, this is what it means to be a good worker, and this is how I identify. And if somebody tells me, if a teacher gives me a bad grade or an employer fires me, then I have to take that personally. And so and then this Victorian school of manners creates these artificial notions of what it means to be fashionable, to have the right opinions, to talk in the right way. If you talk in this way, this is, there used to be a term, political correctness. I like the term HR speak, which is like everything has to be couched in a series of, George Carlin had a routine, or he did a number of routines where he talks about the way we use acronyms as a way to distance ourselves from the reality of painful or ugly things, and we can put them in a box. Like, oh, you're not batshit crazy. You have OCD. You have ADHD. You have NPD. You have these things that we can sterilize, and we can say, okay, well, what you need to do is you need to go to a professional who fulfills the role of the priest. And so when I started to realize those things, I came from a non-religious background, and I was anti-religious. But when I started to think about those things, I started to feel we are not able to remove ourselves from these limiting concepts, these concepts of authority and hierarchy and, Jesus good, devil bad. Well, we can eliminate that particular set of limits, but we're never going to escape the problem of good or evil. Even if, as I was an anarchist, and you can declare yourself a moral nihilist, but to the extent that people exist in the world, morally in the world, or I should say politically and socially, we're really only able to interact with those things as creatures which have a concept of narrowness and limitations. And if you truly free yourself from that, I suppose you would simply be living life as an animal, or you would simply be living your life through the body. You could say like an athletic act could be an amoral act or something like that. But yeah, it's very difficult to do that. So it is kind of a mind-body dichotomy where I think there probably is some aspect where we can tap into an animal reality or an animal perception through bodily practices, whether that's martial arts, qigong, yogic practices, whatever. But to the extent that we are mindful creatures, we are moral creatures. Even putting aside, and actually, there's a case to be made that even though morality, I would tie it to sociality, but when we are more alone, we actually sometimes become more moral. And that's why I diagnose depression as an illness of morality, that someone has designated that the world is bad and I am bad, and that is a moral designation. That's not a factual, sensual, bodily designation, because otherwise it wouldn't be emotional depression, it would be physical pain. But actually, people can contort themselves with a psychosomatic effects, can actually create physical pain for themselves through that moral judgment of themselves and the world. So to be able to escape moral paradigms, when they're not working, when they're broken, they're decayed or self-destructive, that is important. But as I think what you're pointing to is the fact that you might escape one moral paradigm, but you eventually have to, if you want to be truly honest, you have to understand that even in your escape from one, king to another king, like there's still going to be a king,
Mhm.
there's still going to be a ruler, and that ruler exists within you, it exists within other people, and it's inescapable. In Greek mythology, I think this is represented by the Kronos killing Uranus and Zeus killing Kronos. Is that you can kill your father, but eventually you have to start making laws again. You have to become the
Mhm.
king. You have to set the limits and set the boundaries. So I guess that's my reaction. Are you taking notes as well?
Yes, just so I can. So much good stuff. I kind of want to be able to rewind the conversation while we talk, so that yeah. Is that okay?
Yeah, I mean you're the first person to take notes, so I appreciate it. That's a good listening skill. I could probably take more notes in these interviews as well.
I'm just doing it for my own purposes, but yeah, it's I you mentioned a lot of stuff, and so I'm just like a little shorthand that I could return to. Yeah, so much good stuff. Gosh.
I'm sorry, I was on mute for a second. So
Oh,
what I
yeah.
was
I
I was
wondered
trying
where
to
you went,
formulate
but
I was trying to formulate a question about other areas that you've explored besides Buddhism, and I think one of those is Jungian psychology and psychoanalysis. Could you explain a little bit about your experience with that and what sort of lessons or insight that's granted?
yeah. Okay, so Jung, I I have not really ever been a a devout or serious like student of Jung or his psychology. Jung has just throughout my life, I mean all of my life, everywhere I ever went, whether it was in intellectual discourse or spiritual seeking or anywhere I went, Jung is always there. He shows up and he pops up everywhere. And now, and so I've never really studied him or read him seriously. It's just the kind of random quotes that pop up from Carl Jung all over the place. And every single time I encounter Jung, there's a consistent, it's again, we're pattern recognition machines, but it's just like every single time I hit Jung, it's like, yes, 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 yes. And over decades, you start to kind of have a deep respect for this name that keeps coming up, that no matter where it comes up, this guy is standing there kind of waiting as a sentinel, as someone who has explored the deep recesses of the human psyche. So I'm not a really serious student of him, but I do feel like so much of what he did and his research and his thinking and his writing and his own experience resonates just so powerfully with my thinking and my real life experience, which is that I'm gonna probably slaughter it, but so I don't necessarily quote Jung, but I have things that I feel like Jung would understand if only I could have a chat with him, which is that when I have experiences, when I deep dive into my own psyche and my own questioning and my own internal dialogue, I find um, just interconnectedness, and I find archetypal figures, even though like I don't necessarily jive with the standard Jungian definitions of, well, there's this archetype, and this archetype, and those are all the archetypes there are. I have my own sense of my own internal how I think I'm actually Worlds Rise is developing its own language and its own conception for how I speak about how, I guess one of the words is interiority. Like, how do I speak to my own interiority or my own interior experience? What words can these limited words that I have, like you mentioned George Carlin use saying that acronyms were kind of a way to box up a difficult concept into a euphemism so it didn't hurt so much to talk about or to see. And I believe that we take it a step further. In fact, every single word is that. I mean, there are, of course, more extreme triggering, violent, and emotionally laden words that we can use. I mean, we now know that all the expletives and swear words actually live in a different part of our brains than normal language, but all of language are pointers to structures, and everything is just a way to point at these deeper internal structures which form our internal landscape, which is actually shared. It's co-shaped and co-influenced. We are shaped by our families of origin, our cultures, the ideologies, and even the physical structures of the walls we live in, the roads we drive on, and the goods we consume are shaping forces in our psyches. And we are shaped, we process, metabolize, react, and then we shape. And the process is cyclical. It's amazing. I don't know if I said anything coherent there at all.
Well, I thought the fact that all words they confine. Again, that's I was a reader. I defined myself probably from fourth grade onwards, or said I'm a reader, and I always knew I wasn't really good at math, so I said I'm a verbally intelligent person. I'm good with words. And so I've always been biased toward words as a positive thing. And the idea that words inherently necessarily confine and restrict, and that something is lost when it's put into
Yes.
words. That when you use one word to define a thing, you are excluding certain aspects of that thing which cannot be captured by the word. You are narrowing your field of perception. And so, words are tools of the mind to do what the mind does, which is it constricts and it narrows the field of vision. And that's not something that I was aware of. And I think that was because I had an inherently positive view, or I'll say like an expansive or constructive view of consciousness and wisdom and knowledge. And I thought, okay, the more words that I learn, because I was really proud of my vocabulary. People could say, when I was a kid, people would say, oh, you have an adult vocabulary, you have a college level vocabulary. And so that was something that, and I had a special precociousness. Now that I'm older, people have caught up with me. But when I was a kid, I really remember we did in English class, it would be like, here are the 10 words for the week, and at the end of the week, we're going to quiz you on what the words are. And I would never have to study. I would just look at the word and its definition, and that's all that it took. And whenever I've studied languages, I always found that I had this tendency where people would say, okay, how do you translate this sentence? I would never be at a loss for words. Even if I was wrong, I would always have some hypothesis of what those words meant, because I could always connect them to another word. So for me, I always had this sense of strength, or unusual strength in that area versus other places where I was more mediocre. And so I invested a lot in words and believing that, words are a force for good, and everyone needs to read more. We all need to expand your vocabulary, learn more words. I remember there was an anecdote about Malcolm X when he was in prison. He just read the dictionary from front to back so he could expand his
Hmm.
vocabulary. And
Hmm.
that sort of attitude might be more extreme than what I was doing, but still, yeah, it was. So it was hard for me to conceive of words as limiting, and I think that my perspective is more open now because I'm maybe less adverse to the idea of limitation. Um, and so I accept and understand that words are going to be limiting tools, and it's okay because it's okay to have limitations. It's okay to have boundaries. Um, but there is a tension between the desire to be limitless, the desire to have no boundaries,
Hmm.
um, and on the other hand, the human desire for familiarity and stability and consistency. Um, so I've had that tension in all sorts of areas of my life where it's like difficult to stay in one area for too long, or um, human relationships, or political ideologies, or settling down into a particular religion, or that's a lot of the feedback I get from people close to me. Is they say, why don't you just settle for this? And I think there's a part of me that's oppositional to that. Thinks, no, if I'm growing, if I'm expanding, if I'm changing, then I can't be limited. I always have to, be looking for the next big thing. Um, which, yeah, these that dynamic. Some could call it like the some people use the term Faustian spirit. In Platonic metaphysics, you have Peros as the limiting principle and Aperon as the principle of non-limitation. The Greeks used the image of Pandora's box as a symbol of Aperon, whereas uh, the the tradition of Greek statue making was an attempt to confine the human ideal of beauty into a particular form. And the idea was not that you should continuously come up with new and more creative human forms, but that you should there is a Platonic idea. I mean, this is even before Plato was writing, but I think it's his philosophy is derived from this artistic tradition of there is an ideal form of the human body, that the gods have ideal bodies, and our job is to get as close to that ideal as possible. So today we talk about beauty standards and the idea that beauty standards are bad or negative because they're exclusive. Not everybody fits into. I certainly don't fit into the perfect beauty standard. So then there comes this idea that perhaps we should abolish beauty standards and not have any beauty standards whatsoever. But then the question is that metaphysically possible to abolish our idea, because a beauty standard, like a word, is it's an ideal, it's a category um, that we put on things, we put on people. Can we exist outside of that? And I guess my conclusion is, no, we can't.
Hmm.
So we have to balance out, maybe that there is a perfect balance between the exclusionary harshness of a beauty standard that would say, well, you're
Hmm.
worthless
Hmm.
because you don't look a certain way,
Hmm.
but then also that escapism, or running away from that and saying, well, therefore it doesn't exist, or we have to deconstruct it, or we have to abolish it. Realizing that, like Zeus killing his father, you then have to take ownership of beauty standard. If you want to kill the old beauty standard, you now have to institute a new beauty standard. You can't replace
Yes.
something with
Mm-hmm.
nothing. And
Mm-hmm.
this is why, not to get too deep into politics, because I think that's a different wavelength, but I find that oftentimes um, people's political views are oppositional or nihilistic in the sense that they
Mm-hmm.
feel that if we smash or deconstruct the current political order, then we can worry about creating a new one. And my response is typically like you should positively construct a new set of principles, ideals, guiding lights that are so strong and so powerful and so much better than what we have that they just sort of naturally overtake. Like early Christianity, I believe, was just such a powerful idea. It was so irresistible that despite persecution, it just inevitably came to it rose to power. And so that's my belief. If an idea is really truly good enough, then it will displace the previous idea that was not as good, versus saying that because there are flaws to our beauty standards or our political system or our language, language is flawed. Should we therefore abolish language and prevent anyone from speaking at all? Or should we evolve our language or say, if this word isn't good, let's use this better word? I think what George Carlin was critiquing is sometimes safety is not always better. Sometimes protecting people from the ugliness and pain of the world is not always the more moral choice, because by protecting ourselves from pain and ugliness, we're also losing the truth. So we shouldn't just have a one-dimensional view of goodness as being preventing trauma and preventing pain and preventing harm, because that's part of life, and we have to embrace that to an extent if we want to seek the truth. I think that's the point he was making there.
Yeah.
We're also, I just want to give you a caveat. We are coming close to the end of the hour. So I want to give you a chance to respond to all of that, but also give closing remarks, final thoughts. And I've already written down the Pathways lectures that you suggested, but if you have other authors or resources that you want to shout out, I want to give you an opportunity to promote that as well.
Oh, I mean, I don't necessarily recommend or want to point someone to anything. The path work is just an example of something that I came across that was rather mystical and spiritual and channeled. One person's experience started with automatic writing and then became something that she channeled, which was resulted in some quite profound thinking and thoughts, which at least that I was struck with. And she's just one example of a host of people who I feel like work and channel in this mystical spiritual realm. And I could name a whole bunch of others. Helen Schuckman, who channeled A Course in Miracles, and Joseph Smith would be another one. And I can't even think of the one I was watching on YouTube the other day. He's a contemporary mystic, and his name escapes me, but he repeats everything twice. He'll say it in a really quick mutter, and then he'll say it in a normal voice. Gosh, not coming to me right now. No, I'm fine. I'm happy to go a little bit longer. I'm happy to wrap it up in an hour, and we can just regroup and talk further if you want to, or not. I really appreciated the chance to hear your thoughts, and I'm just in a place right now where I don't know what to push necessarily or promote. I know that this idea of worlds arise came to me as a domain name many years ago. And so I've been publishing a, a lot of my thinking and my philosophizing and my synthesizing of what I've just been trying to do under this title of Worlds Arise. And I've thought about trying to do something more with it. There's a few things on Substack that are scattered and um, not very consistent. But right now, I just need some space. I've created this space, and I'm filling it. I'm filling it with thoughts and philosophies and analysis and synthesis and musings and things that feel like uh, that I am being taught. When we engage, there's a process, and not everyone maybe experiences this process. I think each, like you've mentioned, you engage and have engaged since your youth with words and language. So we all kind of probably have propensities to engage and learn in different ways and styles at different times. And for me, this process of engaging with this internal dialogue, and a lot of it really does feel like there is this OCD, this obsessive compulsive component to it that gets concerning to me sometimes. But in the midst of this obsessive compulsiveness, uh, uh, something comes, and something within me seems to be able to have these internal dialogues. And as a result of them, I feel enlightened and taught. And while I know that it is definitely, I don't want to say easy, but the feeling of being enlightened is not the same thing as actually being enlightened. So it's important for me to have checks against um, against things that are could be going off the rails, because there's lots of uh, accounts and incidences of gurus gone awry and religious movements gone south and turned into cults and abusive things. And so at first, when I was deconstructing these things, I'm just like, it was definitely more of an atheistic nihilism, like religion's all bad. It's all a fake. All these gurus are pulling the wool over our eyes. But now I'm realizing that I'm drawing connections between the religious and the spiritual and the psychedelic as ways of exploring the interconnected nature of our minds and our experiences. So it's mostly just to be continued. I don't have anything that I'm really pushing right now. I just really appreciate you reaching out and making contact, and I enjoy the chance to talk. So.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it as well. It's takes two to tango. So I think that it's always brave when people step up to the plate and decide to talk with a stranger on the internet. um, but I enjoy this, and it's very very different from conversations that I have on economics or those specific fields where we're already accepting so much limitation. It's so narrow. And so I really loved what you said about having an open space, like just saying, here is my open space, and I'm going to fill it with whatever fits into that space. And really, different people have different sizes of that space. Some people, it's a very small space. I think for you, you're permitting the space to be as large as the space needs to be. And so it's a mysterious space. It's an unexplored continent, which can be scary, and it can be confusing, and it can feel like, gosh, when you're driving through Kansas, it's just cornfield after cornfield. And when am I going to get to the
Mhm.
city? When am I going to get to the exciting and good stuff? When am I going to be enlightened? Uh, but yeah, I think that's it's just a different approach. And it's a very different approach. It's a very different perspective for most people I talk to. So yeah, I appreciate you providing that. A very different experience than I'm normally able to have with most people. But yeah, I would be happy to speak to you again another time. I'm very slowly working through dialogues with people, so I can't guarantee it'll be soon, but in maybe a grand cosmic sense. Um,
Mhm.
you know, what is a year in the life of a human? So I'm sure we will speak at some point in the future again.
Yeah, I just wanted to leave the door open in case, for future things. But yeah, I appreciate the chance to connect. And so thank you for this time today.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for coming on, and I'm sure we'll talk again. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks. Thanks. You too.
Take care now. Bye bye.
You too.
Okay, so zany. We're getting zany. We're getting out there. Get woo woo. Buddhism, Jungian shadow work. Yeah, that was the most open ended. That was the most open ended conversation I've had so far in terms of we're trying to step outside the bounds of language and probably I think some of you will probably think that's meaningless to kind of if you don't have language, it's what can you even talk about? How can you even speculate about what it would mean to not have language or what it would mean to. And I agree that language is utilitarian. Limitations allow us to do things. So eventually you have to constrain the space if you want to do anything. Um, but simply pointing out that there is something, uh, there is such a thing as an open space, and we can widen the scope of our perception by drilling down into our language, but we can also narrow the scope of our perception we can narrow our perspective by drilling down into language, but we can widen our perspective by dissociating, detaching, or de-emphasizing language by creating distance between ourselves. So we can never become truly, I don't think, enlightened in the sense of being 100%, being totally mute and not having any thoughts. I mean, I suppose if you're dead, but as living creatures, as living minds, we cannot escape the mind. We cannot escape language entirely, but we can we can introduce distance. And I think that's done through the body. I think that's done through physical practice, through athleticism, gymnastics, yoga, qigong, you have it. I think that's how we create that distance. So I would encourage people. I mean, my intention here when I talk about these things is really for people who feel stuck in a certain emotional aspect or spiritual aspect of life. They feel unsatisfied. They feel existential, emotional, spiritual suffering. Is that the way to get out of that imprisonment in a certain paradigm is you widen the paradigm by creating distance, by reconnecting with the body through a physical practice. That's my belief. And let me know what you think. Let me know if this is pseudoscience, or I guess I'm not pretending it's science. It's just kind of it goes under the category of spirituality. So yeah, I have a lot of other content. I have a lot of other interviews where it's much more rational, scientific, empirical, and so on. So look forward to that. If this wasn't your cup of tea, like it anyway. Just support me in what I'm doing. Support the success of this. This is my job. This is my income. If you want to support me financially, you can just also like and comment for free and restack and share it on Twitter and stuff like that. So thank you guys for watching or listening, and I will see you or hear you or something. I will somehow. I just thought in my head we've been talking about language, so I'm not. Am I going to see you? Well, I'm not going to see you unless you have a conversation with me and I see your camera. But I might never see you actually. And if you never comment, I might never hear from you. I might never hear the sound of your voice. So I might actually not see you or hear you. But you'll hear me. You'll hear me and you'll see me next time. Until then, take care. Bye bye, everybody.